Hello, everybody. As Peter said, my name is Luke McGill, and I'm a graduate student at Purdue University. And I'm here today to talk about some of my master's work, which is tracking largemouth bass in the Chicago Area Waterway System. Before we get into these results, I think it's important to kind of set the stage and understand what the Chicago Area Waterway System is. I like to call it the CAWS. A lot of people mostly just say Chicago River. So when you hear that term, when you hear Chicago River, what comes to mind?
Downtown.
Downtown, yep.
It flows back.
It flows backwards. That's a pretty unique thing about the river. I agree with downtown. I was born in Illinois, but I grew up in Michigan. But whenever I'd come back and visit family in Illinois, uh, this is the Chicago River I'd see. You know, it's downtown, surrounded by skyscrapers. It's got these architectural tour boats and these big old steel bridges. But the cause is a lot more than that. So it's actually a series of over 75 miles of slow flowing canals and altered rivers. Before the CAWS was the CAWS, it was the Chicago River, and that's what this looked like. So the Chicago River was used as an open sewer pretty much. You had the North Branch and the South Branch flow into the main stem and then go out into Lake Michigan. And that plume of human waste and pollution was going out and threatening the city's drinking water supply. So the CAWS was created when the Chicago River was dredged, lined with steel walls, connected to the city's sewer system, and of course was reversed. So that created the CAWS with the Chicago Sanitary and Shipping Canal, and also with the North Shore Channel just behind us. We had Lake Michigan flow into the river. But beyond having the river flow backwards, it actually connected the Great Lakes Basin with the Mississippi River Basin. So that allowed for these barges to move between Lake Michigan and the Mississippi River through the CAWS. This unregulated pollution and treating the CAWS as an open sewer continued until about the 1970s when the Clean Water Act was passed. A key phrase in that is that public water should be fishable and swimmable. So in theory, the EPA has set effective water quality standards so that recreational use should be possible in and on the river. I believe most of us wouldn't swim in the river nowadays at its current state. But with that, there have been a lot stricter regulations on the type of pollution. There's been greatly improved water quality, which first just started with treating water before sending it into the CAWS. And this has greatly increased the diversity and abundance of fishes in the river. So we see a lot more bluegill, a lot more blunt-nosed minnows, gizzard shad, and largemouth bass. So different levels of the food web have all increased. And then at any given sampling site, the number of species has increased from about 5 to 12. So the water quality in the CAWS has increased, but there's still one main issue, and that is combined sewer overflows. So the city of Chicago's sewer system is connected with the storm system, and that's fine for most times during dry weather. When you flush a toilet, that just goes down into the sewage drain and then to water treatment plants. But during wet weather, especially during really heavy rainfall, all that water will inundate the city's sewer system. And instead of backing up and flooding people's basements, it instead is just dumped out into the river. So because of that, because of these legacy pollutants in the river as well, much of the waterway just isn't suitable for any human body contact. So it's unfortunately not at the place that we want it to be. To try to fix this, the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District has begun TARP, which is the Tunnel and Reservoir Plan. It's these gigantic tunnels that are dug underground, as well as very large reservoirs to capture and divert stormwater away during periods of heavy rainfall, and then later send that water to water treatment plants during dry weather. So right now they have about a few billion gallons of storage that's supposed to greatly increase. So by the end of this decade, there should be around 18 billion gallons of storage that should really reduce the amount of sewer overflows into the river. However, extreme precipitation events are predicted to increase with climate change. So we still have chances for combined sewer overflows even into the 2030s. So when you think about the CAWS nowadays, it's a lot different from its original intended purpose. We're not treating it as an open sewer anymore. I think that's a pretty good idea. Um, it still is a pretty heavily used shipping lane though. But overall, there's this effort to enhance both the public perception and use of the river. So this pretty well-known example is the Chicago City Riverwalk in downtown Chicago. But there have been other habitat restorations and habitat enhancements. So several floating islands have been installed in the north and south branches of the river. This is called the Wild Mile. It is on the North Branch Canal on one side of Goose Island. And a cool thing about these floating islands is that they can provide green space for people. So, there's these floating walkways, pretty plants to look at. There's also kayak launches on this floating island. So people can use this area to be near the river, but also get on the river. Besides providing green space, they provide additional habitat for both aquatic and terrestrial organisms. And then as these plants grow, they can remove some excess nutrients and pollutants. So with all these changes to the CAWS, it got us thinking, what do the fish think about all this? So we're doing this fish tracking project for the main objective, which is to better understand just the fish behavior and movement within the river, but also try to identify some areas for further enhancement. So we have 4 main objectives of this study. The first is to determine how fish are responding to those low water quality events. So how they respond to those combined sewer overflows, and if they go anywhere specific in the river, like are there special areas in the river that they use as refuge. Second, we just want to know more about these fish. More people fish in the river nowadays. They catch bass and carp. The abundances of those fish have increased. So we want to know just what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. How much are they moving? Where are they spending their time? And how that might change as the seasons change. Third, we want to identify spawning areas. There's still a lot of pollutants, especially in the river sediment of this river, and several fish species, including largemouth bass, create nests in the river sediment and they lay their eggs. So wherever they're doing that, it must be some relatively clean river bottom for those eggs to actually hatch and survive. And then lastly, we want to identify overwinter areas. Like a lot of places in the Midwest, no one wants to go outside on the water and actually sample. Yeah, did you have a question?
So the North Branch of the Chicago River, when those gates are open in the harbor, does it flow into the lake?
Yeah, so they are, yeah. So they are very, those gates will open to allow boat traffic in, and then there are some unique moments in time when the river is so high that those gates are opened, and then the river will flow into lake.
Sewers going into that North Branch, I know I found out there was a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so those combined sewer overflow pipes, those are all throughout the river. So raw sewage will be dumped into the river just automatically if there's too much water in the sewer system, and that occurs throughout the river. It's usually like a pretty short period that happens. It's only during really heavy periods of rainfall.
And that treatment plan on Howard and Foreman, sewage treatment?
And like the northern part, is that near Skokie?
Howard and Foreman, it's, yeah, like
Skokie.
Evanston.
Yeah.
So that water, after it's treated, goes into the North Branch?
Yep. So that is treated. It is to effective water quality standards, and yeah, there's an outflow pipe in the North Shore Channel, a few miles down this North Shore Channel. To meet these main objectives that we had, we are using a technology called acoustic telemetry. So the way acoustic telemetry works is that we equip these fish with acoustic transmitters. They're like a little bit larger than a pill. These acoustic transmitters send out actual sound pulses throughout the water about once every 3 minutes. And then we have these receivers all throughout the river to detect those pulses. So it's not like we're getting like a fish track. We don't get to see live movement of a fish, but when these fish are near the receivers, we'll be able to know which tag was detected and when it was detected. So we've tagged 80 total fish. We did this tagging last June, so June of 2023. Of those 80 fish, we tagged 32 largemouth bass, but we have a few other species such as bluegill and common carp and one walleye. So these batteries, these tags last about just over a year. So we hope to continue to get data from these fish up until June or July of this year. So this is a map of all the receivers that we have within the Chicago Area Waterway System. So it's a pretty big area. We have 33 total receivers, and then it covers about 40 kilometers of the river. So because it's such a big study area, I've broken it down into 8 different river segments. So first we have the north branch of the river that flows south around Goose Island and then connects with the main stem. On the other side of Goose Island is that North Branch Canal, that Wild Mile floating island site. The main stem receives water from Lake Michigan, connects with the North Branch. That flows south into the South Branch. And as it goes around this bend, it meets up with Bubbly Creek. This is a small tributary arm of the river. There are some additional floating islands at this area. There are a large turning basin for barges. That's that little square. And then there are some barge slips there as well. After all that, we have the Chicago Sanitary and Shipping Canal, that completely altered canal that's completely artificial and dug out. We have 2 main clusters of receivers here. We have clusters around this Bubbly Creek, this Park 571 area, because we have some floating islands there. And then we have clusters of receivers at the Wild Mile because we have floating islands there as well. So first, looking at just how these fish are moving about on a day-to-day basis, we see 2 personalities of fish emerge. So first, we see these largemouth bass that are drifters. They're pretty active. They don't have any affinity towards any one area of the river. So these plots are called abacus plots. Stand over here. Each dot represents a detection. At the y-axis, we have these 8 different river segments, and then this is just looking at detections through time. So each plot is a different fish. If we look here at this fish, number 17915, that is a largemouth bass that likes hanging out in Bubbly Creek, but then it was hanging out in Park 571, then barge slips, then the south branch of the river, etc. So we have some fish that are moving around a lot, no real affinity towards any area. But then on the other hand, we have these fish that are pretty lazy. We like to call them homebodies. They're fishes that are really hanging out in just 1 or 2 segments of the river. So we have a lot of fish that hang out in these barge slips, and they may poke their head out into Park 571, but then come back in. And it's kind of the same story with fish hanging out at that Wild Mile. They're hanging out there most of the time. They may swim up into the North Branch a little bit, but then they're coming back down. So you guys probably remember this more than me since I live in West Lafayette, Indiana, but in July of last year, there's this really big rainstorm. Some parts of the city received over 8 inches of rain. So this completely inundated the city's sewer system. There was a lot of flooding into people's basements, a lot of flooding into streets. So that was obviously not a good thing, but it was a good opportunity for us to see how fish reacted to these combined sewer overflow events. So all throughout the city, like I said, or all throughout the river, there are these sewer overflow pipes. But then in Bubbly Creek, there is actually a water pumping plant. So this is Bubbly Creek. At the end of Bubbly Creek, there is a water pumping plant. And in July, over 2 billion gallons of raw sewage was pumped into Bubbly Creek. So that's obviously not a good thing. We wanted to see how fish were reacting to that. So again, these are abacus plots. We have 5 individual bass and 2 carp. So if we first just look at these bass, we have a darker rectangle, which represents when the river was re-reversed. The water was actually so high that those gates were opened and the water flowed out into Lake Michigan for just about a 24-hour period of time. And then this lighter rectangle represents when that sewage pumping event occurred in Bubbly Creek. These 5 bass were in Bubbly Creek at the time of that event occurring. Very quickly, they leave Bubbly Creek. They go into areas such as Park 571, these barge slip areas, into the south branch of the river. So there's not one specific place that they're going to, but none of them like Bubbly Creek. They're all exiting probably because there's 2 billion gallons of raw sewage in that area. So additionally, this bass unfortunately died. It stopped being detected during the sewage pumping event. But then really interestingly, we had 2 carp actually swim out into Lake Michigan. So these carp were last detected in the main stem of the river. They were last detected at a receiver that was closest to Lake Michigan, and they were last detected when that river was re-reversed. So we don't have receivers out in Lake Michigan, just on the other side of the river, but it's a very high probability that these fish said, screw it, we're getting out of this dump and we're heading to greener pastures.
These just regular carp?
These are common carp, yeah. So if we look at the total fish that we had tagged, of those 80 fish, we had around 10 to 20 individuals hanging out in Bubbly Creek every day. This black line represents when that sewage pumping event occurred. And you can see a very quick drop off. So before that sewage pumping event, 10 to 20 individuals hanging out there. It was a good spot. Afterwards, even months afterwards, we only had around 2 to 3 individuals there. So we were curious to see why. And the reason why is that Bubbly Creek became Bubbly Creek again. So this is a video of the mouth of Bubbly Creek and a week after that sewage pumping event. The sewage settled down to the bottom of Bubbly Creek and was being broken down by bacteria, and methane was produced and was bubbling up. It was so bad, even weeks afterwards, that we did not feel safe enough to walk into a biohazard situation in Bubbly Creek. However, a month after, we finally said, screw it, we're going to enter Bubbly Creek. So this is on August 3rd, again, a month after that sewage pumping event. You can see that this water is really, really green. So as that sewage settled to the bottom and was being broken down, a lot of nutrients are being released. And we had these really large algae blooms. So during the day, this algae is, photosynthesizing, it's creating oxygen. However, at night, they're using up all this oxygen. So we saw these really large swings in dissolved oxygen, and that just isn't a good habitat for fish. So overall, we saw that even months after the sewage pumping event, it really wasn't a good habitat for these fish to be in. So now if we look at just overall habitat use by largemouth bass, seeing where these fish are hanging out all throughout the river. These are maps called detection bubble maps. So each point represents one of those receivers, and then the size of those points represents the average number of detections. And then that 6 represents June. So I have June, July, August, all the way into November. So just looking overall at the total number of detections, we see we were getting detections all the way up in that north branch of the river. However, we weren't seeing any detections at our southernmost receivers. So fish are swimming long distances, but they're mostly swimming up north as opposed to down south. Again, if you look at Bubbly Creek, fish aren't going in there. Largemouth bass are very infrequently entering Bubbly Creek after that sewage pumping event. So in June, these sizes of the dots are relatively large. However, afterwards, we get either no detections or very few detections. So for example, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little tiny dot here in Bubbly Creek in October. And that just kind of represents fish going into the mouth of Bubbly Creek, just kind of feeling it out, but they're realizing that it's still not a great place to be in. Lastly, we see 2 main hotspots of detections. This is that Wild Mile area where the floating island is, and then the Park 571 area with some barge slips. So these were where we released these fish. So there is some bias towards that, but this pattern still holds true throughout this entire 6-month duration. We had fish that kind of swam around, but have since come back. So there's something special in these areas that's attracting fish. So that was looking kind of at like the popularity of places where fish are hanging out most. But if we investigate where like the average number of individuals are hanging out in those 8 different river segments, we can see a slightly different story. So this is just a bar plot showing the average number of individuals in each of these 8 river segments. This is for the month of June. And then this red bar represents Bubbly Creek. So in June, again, we had bass that were liking that area. We had about 5 or so individuals there every day. Again, in July, that number decreases, and that remains the same for this entire study duration. If we look at the main stem of the river, the opposite pattern occurs. So we had like 1 to 2 bass on average hanging out in the main stem of the river throughout the summer. But then as October and November rolls around, that number increases to around 5 individuals. So it was interesting to see that more and more bass as time goes on are entering the main stem of the river. If we look at the Wild Mile, again, that site that we had these artificial floating islands installed at, the number or the use of that Wild Mile actually decreases over time. So that's that gray bar at the end. We had around 5 individuals hanging out there, and that number decreases over time to just around 1 or 2 individuals hanging out there. Kind of a similar story with Park 571. That's just right outside of Bubbly Creek. It also has some floating islands installed. It's this yellow bar, and it goes down over time. So we had around 10 individuals hanging out there at first, and then that drops to around 5. Overall, though, it's still like the second most popular place for these largemouth bass to be at. So it's still a relatively popular area. But then lastly, if we look at barge slips, that number remains consistently high. So we had about 10 individuals there every single day throughout this entire study. So we were really, I don't know, surprised, I guess, to see this many fish inhabiting those barge slips. You know, that's 10 out of the around 30 bass that we've tagged.
The more vegetation in the barge slip.
You just wait, you just wait. So yeah, we were also wondering, you know, what's special about these places. So these are these barge slips. Go over here. They're away from the main channel. That's number one. So most of the CAWS is still used for shipping. It's these really straight edge sites. There are these steel walls that are lining most of the river. It's relatively frequently dredged out as well to make, you know, a clear shipping lane. But then if we look at these barge slips, they are vegetated. There's overhanging trees. There's also some more natural shoreline. And then there's also like trees that have fallen in. So there's a lot more complex habitat, especially compared to the rest of the river. But it's just really interesting that about a third of our studies, our study fish are hanging out in an area that is really, really small relative to the entire study area that we have. We also had fish hanging out in these turning basins. So these are used for big barges to turn around, but they're also kind of away from the main channel of the river. I like to think of them kind of as like a pond. You know, we have this relatively boring main channel of the river, but then we have this more open area. There's again some more natural shoreline. So
Turning like that, do they stir everything up? Create more food?
I don't know if they really stir many things up. It's mostly just an area for them to actually turn around. They could. I haven't seen it in person though, but that's actually a fair idea that could be happening. So overall, again, I've shown this in several different plots. These sewage overflow events and these sewage pumping events especially are really reducing the available habitat for these fish. So we had a lot of fish hanging out in Bubbly Creek until that sewage pumping event. We can see that fish are preferring some areas away from others. So it's specifically areas away from the channel, areas that are away from boat traffic and have more complex habitat. We see habitat use change over time. For example, more fish entering the main stem of the river. So this leads to a question, you know, is what's good for people also good for fish? If we continue to enhance the habitat on this river, provide green space for people, but we do it in a way that can also provide additional habitat for these aquatic organisms. So I only showed you guys about 6 months worth of data. Again, these tags last over a year. So we are really looking forward to seeing what we're going to get in these next few months. So what's next for me is I got to get back on the water soon, and I got to download all this overwinter detection data. So we're interested to see if that pattern continues for fish inhabiting the main stem, if we're going to see an increase in individuals inhabiting that area. When I first started this project, St. Patrick's Day wasn't really on my radar. But as I talked to other people about this, so many people have asked me, what do these fish do when they dye the river green? And it's really got me interested too. I saw these memes that were shared on Twitter a couple weeks ago during St. Patrick's Day. So I'm pretty excited and fired up to get that data back and analyze it. And then lastly, we want to monitor bass during spawning to identify these spawning locations.
Answer that question. Why do they continue to allow fish to dye the river green?
So
More Irish people than any other.
I mean, it's definitely a tradition. Yeah, it's definitely a tradition. I'm sure if they say, hey, we're gonna stop dyeing the river green.
They've written letters on what kind of effect does that have on the fish? And I'm asking you that question.
Yeah.
Do you know what kind of effect it has?
I don't yet. Yeah, we'll find out. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Do you have fish that regularly habitat under the river? And that's pretty much the thing of water in the whole system.
Yeah, so it's water from Lake Michigan. So that was the main stem that I was talking about. So in November, we had like 5 individuals hanging out there. And that was just of largemouth bass, but we have common carp that are hanging out there as well. I think one of the issues with the main stem is it doesn't have much habitat. It's it's a straight cut canal. There's a lot of that architectural tour boat traffic. I think that may drive some fish away. So then my last point real quick is that we're also interested to see where these fish are during spring spawning periods. So even though we saw less and less fish use the wild mile as time went on, larval fish have been found near these floating islands, leading us to believe that that adults are using those islands or nearby those islands to spawn. And then these floating islands are kind of rearing habitat for these larval fish. So with that, I'd like to thank Indiana Illinois Sea Grant. They helped fund this project along with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. This is a collaborative project with Purdue University, Indiana Illinois Sea Grant, and Shed Aquarium. So I'd like to thank all those that have helped out. And thanks everybody here for listening. And I'll take any questions if we have time.
Yeah. When I grew up in the city, I was told as a kid why they named Bubbly Creek, Bubbly Creek. Can you tell me why they named?
Absolutely. So Bubbly Creek was near a lot of these big stockyards where a lot of animal processing was going on. These animal carcasses were just thrown into Bubbly Creek. They were broken down and a ton of methane was bubbled up. So as far as I know, that is completely true. Yeah.